Good afternoon. I'm Mireille Affa'a-Mindzie, Research Fellow in the Africa Program at the International Peace Institute. I'm happy to welcome you to this joint event of IPI's African Leaders Series and the Women, Peace and Security Series. Today we are honored to have with us here Mrs. Beatrice Mtetwa, a human rights activist from Zimbabwe. I first met Mrs. Mtetwa, and I don't think she remembers, at a conflict resolution training workshop organized a few years ago for a group of Zimbabwean lawyers in South Africa, where her presence and interest in the training stood out. I believe negotiation and mediation skills remain critical for her work, even in the even with the recent developments in Zimbabwe. A turbulent 4-year government of national unity is credited with having stopped a rapid economic decline, facilitated the adoption of a new constitution in March 2013, and paved the way for a relatively peaceful election in July. Still, Zimbabwe's new government faces a number of challenges. Among those are the restoration of government's legitimacy and the urgent need to undertake reforms to produce more equitable redistribution of the country's vast resources and to improve the living conditions for all Zimbabweans. Additional challenges include advancing democracy and the rule of law by ensuring the necessary reforms of the judiciary and of the defense and security forces, and by promoting respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. The new constitution of Zimbabwe contains a detailed declaration of rights, and the post-election government has pledged to improve its human rights record. However, as in several other countries in Africa and beyond, the protection of human rights remains unsystematic, and harassment, threats, and attacks on human rights defenders are still common. Our speaker today was herself assaulted by the police on several different occasions and was arrested in March this year, had to stand trial before she was acquitted last month. In a region where persistent human rights abuses, contested electoral processes, popular uprisings, and threats to the independence of democratic institutions remain frequent, human rights defenders play a major role in upholding human rights and advancing inclusive and accountable governance. A devoted human rights advocate whose work has been recognized by several legal and international organizations, Beatrice Mtetwa, by her personal experience and her representation of various journalists, political leaders, and human rights organizations and activists, highlights the challenges that weak rule of law poses to accountable governance in Zimbabwe and in African countries in general. Her biography is printed in the handout that has been distributed. We have asked Ms. Mtetwa to share her story and tell us what led her to become a human rights advocate and why it matters for her country and for Africa more generally. In doing so, she will address 3 main concerns. First, to examine the role civil society plays in advancing accountable governance. Second, to explain the particular challenges women human rights defenders face in pursuing their activities. And third, to consider ways in which the international community can support civil society and human rights defenders in their efforts to promote democracy, governance, and the rule of law. I will now give the floor to Beatrice, who will present her remarks for about 20 minutes, after which we'll have a Q&A session. Beatrice, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mireille. I probably won't be able to cover everything she says I should cover, and I'll just encourage everybody to raise those areas that I would not have touched on during the Q&A, so that at least we cover everything. Thank you very much to the IPI for the invitation. I was wondering how it came about, but now I know that she probably was the reason why I'm here today. I think most of you who have an interest in Zimbabwe know that Zimbabwe has just come out of an election after a very difficult government of national unity where there was contestation. There was more time spent on the contestations than on actually doing the governance and actually also preparing ground for after the government of national unity. But during that process, I think most of you will be aware that there was a constitution-making process and that the people of Zimbabwe went and voted in a referendum for the new constitution on the 16th of March this year, and that the constitution subsequently became law in around May this year. As she has said, it is a constitution that looks fantastic on paper. But of course, which constitution doesn't? Because virtually all politicians, when they are contesting for power, they'll promise that they'll give you X, Y, Z. And we always have these constitutions that have all the oversight institutions that we require. But the problem is almost always in the implementation of those wonderful concepts that will be there in the Constitution. And as she has said, our new Constitution has, under Chapter 12, many, many nice-sounding commissions. We have a Gender Commission. We have, of course, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. We have the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission. We have the Media Commission, the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission, the Anti-Corruption Commission, and, you know, you go on and on and on. And it's great that they are there because that ought to be the foundation. But of course, as I've said, there's nothing unusual about these commissions. They are almost always there in most constitutions. We had the Human Rights Commission established, in fact, under the old, well, not the old constitution, but under the government of national unity, because it was supposed to be a part of that government for that short period in order to deal with human rights issues. Unfortunately, although it was established in the sense that commissioners were appointed, that is all that happened. They were completely underfunded, under-resourced. They had no offices. They each operated from their own homes or wherever they lived, and at the end of the day, we had two of the prominent commissioners resign. And for us, it was a very bad start in that we had this institution which had a lot of work to do, which needed to be done before the end of the government of national unity, but which couldn't do anything at all. And despite that government being inclusive, the politicians from both sides of the divide did not actually think it was crucial to have legislation that specifically dealt with that commission and what its powers were and how it would be funded and how it should operate. So we had this high-sounding body with no operating legislation that enabled it to do anything at all. If they required pens, they had to go to the Minister of Justice, who really was one of the people whose ministry they ought to have had oversight over. And therefore, at a practical level, for me, it meant that we'd go back exactly where we were before, even when the new legislation, or the new constitution came into effect. We have these Chapter 12 institutions. Virtually all of them need legislative provisions, just like the Human Rights Commission. Unfortunately, I believe that a fundamental error was made in the crafting of the global political agreement that brought into effect the government of national unity. In my personal view, that fundamental mistake was not to make it a part of that government of national unity to then have the legislation that would look after these oversight institutions put in place before a new government comes in. In my view, if that had been done, at least we would have had the legislation that tells us what the Gender Commission is supposed to do. As we speak, actually, we still don't have a gender commission. And nobody knows what it is supposed to do. We've seen that those oversight institutions that have had members appointed, the appointment process has not been transparent, it has not been all-inclusive, etc. So we don't even know how the Gender Commission is going to have its members appointed. The same applies to the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, etc. What it then means is that the new government that came in after the elections will have to craft the legislation that needs to deal with these commissions and what their parameters are. And of course, as we all know, politicians are not known to craft legislation that might not be in their best interest. And the likelihood of that legislation not actually capturing what the people said should be the mandate of this constitution is extremely high. I think all of you know that currently our parliament has more than a 2/3 majority of one political party. And therefore, literally, all legislation that is going to come out of that process will be determined by that majority. And that majority is the majority that resulted in the government of national unity coming into effect. And the fact that we don't even have a time frame of when this legislation must come into effect means that actually they can wait until the end of this parliament to craft anything at all, if they will craft that legislation. They could very well say that, look, it can wait for the next parliament because we are not we don't have time to finish this legislation because currently, right now, Zimbabwe has, according certainly to the politicians, more pressing issues to be dealt with than the oversight institutions that politicians almost always think are a waste of time. So you can see that already the implementation of this document is at a very precarious stage because we don't know where it will go from here. We have seen, for instance, in the judiciary, and in my view, and I know that I'm biased because I'm a lawyer, the judiciary is one of the most crucial pillars of any governance system. You are not likely to have any investment in the country if investors are not assured that they will have any disputes in the country properly determined by a judiciary that's considered to be independent. And Zimbabwe right now is in desperate need of foreign direct investment, and it's not likely to come about if the foreign investor is not certain that their investment will not go one way if there is a dispute. We have a judiciary, which the Constitution said must be appointed through a public process where there would be advertisements, etc. But soon after the Constitution had come into effect, there was a mad rush to appoint judges, including judges to the Constitutional Court. Yet the understanding was that the Constitutional Court, being a new court being created by the new constitution, would obviously have to be have its members appointed in terms of the new constitution and whatever legislation comes under that. There was no amendment to the law to do that. And we just had a couple more judges appointed to make up the numbers so that the same judges who sit in the current Supreme Court became the same judges who mostly also sit in the Constitutional Court. So basically what we've had was to expand what was there previously and make it a constitutional court. And therefore, really, at the end of the day, there is not going to be a change in terms of new persons interpreting the new constitution because we are having exactly the same people there. This obviously means that the rule of law issues, the independence of the judiciary discourse is going to continue because nothing has changed on the ground. The same applies. We have a new National Prosecuting Authority, which in terms of Section 260 of the Constitution must be independent. It must not be directed by anybody. But how have we had the new Prosecutor General appointed? We've just had the old Attorney General moved to become the new Prosecutor General. And currently, attempts are underway because he has argued most vociferously that you cannot separate the Attorney General as legal advisor to government from the prosecuting arm of government. So there are current attempts to have the Constitution amended to get back that body, the two bodies into one Attorney General with the two wings. And I mean, the ink is not even dry on that Constitution. But more importantly, the Prosecutor General is the same person that we have said has selectively applied the law throughout the time of the Government of National Unity. And from 2008, when he was appointed, he has, in fact, selectively prosecuted certain persons and has deliberately not prosecuted persons who have cases to answer, but who he believes ought to be protected. I'll just give you examples of what currently has been going on. We've had an anti-corruption commission commissioner prosecuted. He was acquitted only about last week. And the reason he was prosecuted is because he worked with a group of persons who were working under the then Prime Minister's office to tabulate, what is considered to have been corrupt practices by very powerful people. They had prepared dockets and the evidence was there, and he was arrested along with them for basically, because he was a commissioner, he was charged firstly under the Official Secrets Act, which obviously doesn't apply to him if he's an independent anti-corruption commissioner. And also there were allegations that he and the other four were impersonating the police because they had compiled dockets. Of course, there's no law that says only police can compile dockets for presentation, for prosecution. And he prosecuted that commissioner right up to the end. And he was, of course, acquitted. But the point is, this is the same Attorney General who has now become the Prosecutor General. And the prosecution included, or rather the dockets that they were preparing, included allegations of corruption against the very same Attorney General and or Prosecutor General. Now, the question is, should someone with that background really take over this new position if we are to change the dynamics of the rule of law in Zimbabwe? No, I don't think so. The other four who were arrested with this commissioner have taken the matter up with the Constitutional Court. In fact, the reason I was arrested is because I was called to the home of one of these four when the police raided his home looking for these dockets. And it was when I got there that I was arrested for obstructing the police when I asked them for a search warrant. They have successfully challenged this in terms of, the prosecution by saying, refer it to the Constitutional Court to determine whether or not this man is actually, sufficiently independent to mount the prosecution against us. And the most incredible part of it was that one of the prosecutors was actually prosecuting them at the Magistrates Court, actually also had a specific docket relating to him for corruption. So here was a prosecutor prosecuting persons investigating him for corruption. I mean, it's just So that's why we are thinking, oh, you know, maybe we do have a new constitution, but where exactly is it going to take us? And of course, what can we do about it? What is the way forward? What can civil society do? It's very difficult for me to believe that really this new constitution can be what the people voted for in March if we have the same old brooms trying to implement it. So civil society must therefore clearly have a way of trying to implement it. But what would be the starting point for civil society, given the fact that basically the system is completely loaded against civil society? Civil society was not allowed to participate in the constitution-making process. It really had very little say in how the constitution-making process should have been done. And if we are to challenge the Constitution, obviously it means we have to go to the Constitutional Court. And we know that going to the Constitutional Court is not likely to be taken well, because we'll in effect be saying to the judges, sorry, your lordships, you have not actually been properly appointed, because you were not appointed in terms of the constitutional provisions that require that there be advertisements, this and that. And therefore, please disband. I mean, are they going to do so? No, we know that they are not going to do so. So what do we do outside litigating against what clearly are oversight institutions that are being crippled even before they get implemented? Maybe if we have the alignment, because all these new institutions require new legislation, maybe if we do have proper legislation coming out of Parliament, you know, and properly aligning the constitutional provisions to practically affecting them, maybe, again, we might be able to use that legislation to say there has been non-compliance with XYZ in the Constitution. We could perhaps try and use the fact that I think Section 34 of the Constitution now says that there has to be legislation, domestic legislation, for all protocols, treaties, etc., that the government of Zimbabwe would have ratified. So once that is done, that perhaps might give us leeway to say, you know, in terms of international best practice, you have to do X, Y, Z. But again, because we have to go through to the same legal system to challenge people who are in that system, we probably will have to look at going outside that system. But most of our African, you know, human rights institutions like the African Commission and the African Court for Human Rights, they require that you exhaust local remedies. So you still have to do that local litigation. And we have had in Zimbabwe a couple of judges who've had commissions of inquiry held to look into their conduct, etc. And the one good thing that has happened is that most of them have had those inquiries done by judges from the region, because it is accepted that it's very difficult for a judge who's in the next room to come and judge you. So we're thinking that we can actually take the Constitutional Court to the Constitutional Court and ask that it recuses itself, and we have the judges from the region appointed specifically to sit to see if, in fact, these judges were properly appointed. And the difficulty of that is that the Chief Justice obviously has to approve the appointment of persons from the region who would then come in. And of course, I mean, it wouldn't be difficult for him to find like-minded judges to come and sit. I mean, we have a Chief Justice in Swaziland who is known for behaving badly. We have a number of judges in the region who would happily come and sit and do what they think they're expected to do by their colleague in Zimbabwe. But what that means is that if we fail, we would be able to then take it out to the regional or continental institutions like the African Commission and the African Court of Human Rights. But of course, we know that those bodies don't have any teeth anyway. You know, you get a communication and a good result from the African Commission, so what? How do you enforce it? You know, you have the African Court. This is an institution that's been in place since 1998. But how many countries have signed that declaration? 26 at last count. Certainly, as in October, there were 26. I don't know if any have since signed since then. How many have actually signed the declaration to be bound by the jurisdiction of that court? 7. This is an African Union institution, wholly set up by Africans. And every day we hear of African solutions to African problems. So why do we only have 7 African countries who've submitted themselves to the jurisdiction of the African Court for Human Rights? So even if we could go to the African Court for Human Rights, and in Zimbabwe we can't because we have not signed. What then can we do? For me, I think that although we can continue advocacy, we can see what can be done, the only way we can really, you know, try and change things is to just litigate and litigate until somebody gets tired and does the right thing. I don't think saying we can't do anything is an option, because then, you know, things can only get worse as opposed to getting better. We have seen institutions like the SADC Tribunal, when it did show some teeth, it was immediately killed and it suffered a horrible stillbirth. And so you can see that there is this culture in the African Union of really our leaders acting as, you know, trade union leaders, making sure that they look after each other's interests ahead of their own people's interests. And it gets harder and harder to try and implement what they would have agreed to, even in their own founding statutes. I am mindful that Zimbabwe is really facing a critical time in terms of its economic performance. The Minister of Finance was supposed to present his budget earlier on today. I was hoping that I would have at least some information on that before I actually speak to you. Unfortunately, there was a slight delay in him presenting the budget, so I don't even know what his budget says. But that budget will require at least 4 billion conservatively. And we know that Zimbabwe does not have capacity to raise $4 billion for that budget. We also know that Zimbabwe would have extreme difficulty in approaching the multilateral agencies for support, because Zimbabwe is in arrears by about 7 billion. So clearly they won't be able to get money from there. So how are we going to take this Zim asset? The government has come up with a very, very nice document. It's called Zim asset, which is supposed to basically revive the economy, restore the health, education, and agricultural sectors, create employment for at least 2.2 million people during the life of this government. And it reads great. It's a fantastic document when you read it. But when you go through it and you look at how it's going to be implemented, there are no KPIs. Nobody knows what will happen if Minister of Agriculture does not meet what is expected of him. There's nothing that's going to happen to him. You know, there will be no indicators as to whether he has performed, and he hasn't. And agriculture has always been the backbone of the Zimbabwean economy. And I think most of you who have an interest in Zimbabwe will know that currently Zimbabwe requires food to feed at least 2 million people. And we need the international community to help us with that. And that help must necessarily include reviving agriculture. And reviving agriculture, in my view, should include making it mandatory to have those who are given farms, particularly those who are given large tracts of land that they are underutilizing, to have an obligation to at least have a certain percentage of their land produce food. We don't eat tobacco. I don't care that people are doing fantastic work farming tobacco, because they farm that tobacco, they get that money, it goes into their pockets, which means only the small farmers in small pieces of land are left to feed the nation. Surely if persons are on government land, which they got under government leases, the government ought to ensure that every person who has that piece of land produces some food, because food security ought to be really uppermost in the minds of those who rule us. If that became government policy, with sanction if necessary, we wouldn't be in this situation where we actually have no food right now and have to depend on donors because we had a bumper crop in tobacco earlier on in the year. And I don't think with political will it would be difficult to make it compulsory to have farmers have dedicated pieces of land that deal with food security issues. Because government should be able to say, as a matter of law, if you have 10,000 hectares of land, at least a third of that should have maize. And if you decide to put tobacco, we will take the equivalent of that 1/3 from your cash crop. When you go to the auction floors, you sell your tobacco, the auctioneer will be obliged to retain that 1/3 to ensure that you can buy food, you know. Okay. And alternatively, if all of that land was parceled to the smaller farmers who are more interested in doing the maize and other food crops, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are in, because the smaller farmers are more reliable in terms of producing food. So my view is that really currently, for as long as we are lacking in political will, we will have a problem in implementing what is in the new constitution. For as long as we are not slaves to transparency and also to eradicating corruption in a way that will make people in the street understand that corruption is a scourge that has to be fought, we are not going to get out of the mess that we are in. Some of you might have learned of the president fingering somebody in the diamond sector for corruption recently. That man had been fingered in a case that I was handling in the courts about 2 years ago for making $130 million worth of diamonds, shrinking into 7 million when the financial statements came out. Nobody did anything about it. He's one of those who's being investigated for corruption by the persons who've been arrested for investigating him. 10 million which he found in the account of the company that he took shrunk to $300,000 when he produced financial statements. And despite the president saying this man is corrupt, he still has not been arrested. We've had in the last couple of months very senior policemen fingered for corruption by the Commissioner of Police. And when civil society said, "Are you prosecuting them?" He said, "Oh, why do you want us to use a sledgehammer to kill a fly? We have dealt with them internally and we will retire them." So why shouldn't people be corrupt if it pays to be corrupt? She has told me that my time is up. But as I said, maybe you can deal with the issues that I didn't touch on when you ask the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you very much for this vivid description of the situation in Zimbabwe after the election, which actually lead us to be very cautious about the post-election government. And also we noticed the challenges, not only at national level, but also at regional level and continental level with what you say, the club of trade unionists, maybe a trade union. I will now open the floor for discussion. And before I do that, I would like to remind you that we are webcasting today's event. Please wait for the microphone to ask a question or make a comment, and state your name and affiliation before asking your question and making your comments. Yes, please, Professor Andreopoulos.
Thank you. George Andreopoulos, the City University of New York. First of all, I would like to thank you for your remarks. You mentioned the National Human Rights Institution, and increasingly in recent years, more and more human rights activists are looking up for these institutions as important platforms to air grievances as well as vehicles for reform. Clearly, in Zimbabwe, we have not even started the work on this. But from your perspective and as a long-standing human rights activist, what do you think should be the strategic priorities of the National Human Rights Commission once it starts functioning? Because one of the the first things that they do once they start operating is develop a strategic plan. And obviously, you cannot address everything in one plan. So what for you are the most important issues that should be on the agenda of the Commission? Thank you.
Thank you. Warren, please, we can have three questions in a round, and we'll give the floor back to Beatrice.
Warren Hogue, IPI, thank you for that presentation, depressing as it is. You've made a pretty strong case that the institutions of Zimbabwe itself are not to be depended upon to give you satisfaction. You've also made the case that African institutions have failed you. My question is there anything the international community can do in the face of this obstruction from national institutions and obstructions even from continental African institutions?
Thank you very much, Madam Mtetwa. I'm the ambassador of Somalia, by the way, and I think I'm the only PR in this group today present. And I came because Somalia is going to have a new constitution and a referendum by 2016. And now the formation of political parties, which should be national, and the formation of these various commissions you have said, it's not only, as you said, depressing, but the task is really scaring, really scary. And I would like to know then what, after all these problems and headaches, what areas are needed for urgent support to a newly elected government, whether it's the judiciary, whether it is any other constitutional bodies, and how best the international community, the African Union in our case and your case, the sub-regional bodies in Africa, how could they avert that this should not happen? How do they support the constitutional and elections and the constitutional process so that the problems you have listed should not occur in the future, as far as possible, of course. But we are not coming out of dictatorship, but we are coming from chaos and practically insecurity in many places. So these are the few things I wanted to ask.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Maybe I'll start with your question first. You know, from my perspective, it's not like the African leaders don't know what is right or wrong. This is why they put what is right in the constitutions. But for some reason, once they taste power, these two-term limits just become, you know, a hurdle for them. And I don't know what it is that we can do to inject them with some kind of medication that will ensure that they don't want to continue staying in power. It's just a power thing. Maybe it's coming from our culture of having permanent chiefs forever. And therefore, they think, once I get in, I'm a chief, and I'm not going to go anywhere because, you know, my chief has remained the same throughout. It really is the lack of political will that results in Africa being where it is. The minute they get in, they want to change what they thought was very, very good when they were not in power. And it's a cycle that we're failing to break. We've seen it happen in Uganda. We know President Museveni said, if anyone changes this constitution, I'm going back to the bush. But he changed it himself without going back to the bush. And it's a culture that we've seen over and over again in Africa. And I don't know whether the African institutions can help or not. I think what we really need is now to try and maybe concentrate on the younger leaders who have not been tainted by the culture of dying in office by our independent leaders who basically are the ones who still remain in power. But how do you do this? I was speaking to somebody last week, and I was saying, we were talking about the Mo Ibrahim Prize for Good Governance, and I was thinking, do we really need that prize? Because I think it would be a fantastic prize if he set up a Mo Ibrahim School of Governance attached to one of the worthy universities and catch the African leaders young and try and inculcate in them this governance issue that will plague us forever if we don't do anything about it. And maybe a new culture of leadership might come out of that, I believe it would be money well spent instead of trying to teach old dogs new tricks. Nobody's going to win that prize because they simply are not interested in it because they make enough from the corrupt activities that they conduct. So I think we need to change the paradigm in a way, look at how best we can have leaders that truly, will carry some of these things forward. I think Somalia has at least many of the other African countries to learn from. For you, it should be a learning curve that, yes, you can have a new constitution in Zimbabwe, but it will not change anything. And maybe you will be able to have a constitution that will be done in such a way that, if the president wants to change it or wants to short-circuit procedures, the entire nation gets involved. I know referenda doesn't work always because, if you can rig an election, you can rig anything anyway. So, we have to try and find ways of trying to deal with how best your new government will be assisted, and how any new constitution that you come up with can be respected, and that those who are in charge of implementing its provisions are men and women of good character, because that also helps. If you have a judiciary that is absolutely and totally independent and will stick to the letter of the Constitution, as opposed to who is pulling the political strings. Your question, what can the international community do? I think Zimbabwe right now is currently suffering from fatigue, because the international community is just so tired, I mean, especially because it's not like there's rivers of blood flowing. And the international community, if it doesn't see rivers of blood flowing, it's like we've got more serious things to look at. And it is true, there are countries. I mean, you look at what is happening in the DRC, you look at what is happening in the Central African Republic, and we're like, why should we care about Zimbabwe? So the international community is so fatigued with Zimbabwe that it no longer actually thinks of Zimbabwe as being on the radar screen. But I believe that really we all have to continue knocking on those governance and democracy doors, because until we have, proper institutions running properly, it's not difficult to see countries regressing, because we've seen it happening in countries where people take the eye off the ball and you go back to where you thought you had come out of. People thought the DRC was out of the woods, but look at where it is currently. So I think it is necessary that we all exercise constant vigilance in ensuring that these countries play by the rules, and those rules should be determined by what's in their constitutions. And the professor asked a question about what the priorities of the new Zimbabwean Human Rights Commission ought to be. What should their strategic plan be in terms of prioritizing what needs to be done? That's very, very important, but this assumes that we will have a functional Human Rights Commission which is manned by men and women who are actually imbued with what we consider to be proper human rights issues. My view is that they ought to ensure that all human rights abuses are dealt with. The culture of impunity in Zimbabwe is what has dragged us down to where we are. The fact that you know who killed whom, when, and how, but you meet them every day and greet them as if they didn't do anything. I think if the Human Rights Commission works with the Peace and Reconciliation Commission to ensure that human rights abuses are dealt with properly by an independent judiciary, and that if they are not, it will be the Human Rights Commission itself, with civil society, that will challenge those who will not be ensuring that, at the very least, we have a commission that is in the forefront of fighting human rights. But obviously, they will need to have funding to do that. And in the absence of legislation on how the commission will be run, it's very, very difficult to say whether or not they will even be able to do what they're supposed to do, because it is possible that the Act will say the Human Rights Commission should not take funding from external imperialist sources, which virtually will mean that we'll starve you of funding and resources, and you will not be able to do anything. So it will all also depend on how the legislation that will be promulgated will be worded at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. We'll have a second round of questions, and I see a number of hands. I will start with Mikiko, and then Ambassador Hirsch, and the lady in the second row. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Mikiko. I'm working for the UN Democracy Fund and deaf. And we have been really privileged to work for Zimbabwe for the last 3 years with a local civil society organization. And I have to say, under the difficult condition environment, CSO, civil society organization in Zimbabwe has been doing great job. And we would like to continue to work with them. You already identified several possible initiatives, like a human rights litigation support, or maybe corruption monitoring, or you may also mentioned maybe human rights commission support or monitoring by civil society organization. This is not my question, but if you can also spread the message, because we also want to have a proposal from Zimbabwe this year. Our proposal process is open until end of this month. And if you can also tell your civil society organization colleague, or you also heading several civil society organization to apply if they have a nice, good proposal, just visit our website, un.org/democracyfund.
First of all, thank you very much for your remarks just now and for the role you're playing in promoting human rights issues in Zimbabwe. Just as a parenthesis, a number of African presidents did step down voluntarily, starting with Nelson Mandela, who, of course, passed away two weeks ago. He stepped down after one term, and President Kaunda stepped down, and several presidents of Tanzania. So this doesn't take away from what you have said, which is very powerful, that a lot of these people don't step down, but there are some examples. I kind of have two questions for you. One is about the role of civil society. You just mentioned civil society. So there are a number of instruments that the African Union and the sub-regional organizations have adopted over and over again, as you have explained very clearly, which are not implemented. So is there in any country that you can identify a meaningful role for civil society in trying to implement those instruments? And my second question has to do with young people in Zimbabwe. And we had a discussion here in the summertime, and one of the points that was made was that in Zimbabwe, a lot of young people are no longer there. In fact, it was asserted that most young people have left Zimbabwe. They're in South Africa or they're elsewhere because they don't see much possibility of change in Zimbabwe. So what is your understanding of what's happened with Zimbabwe youth? And if they're not in the country, can you foresee, as long as the incumbent is in power and alive, sort of this sort of continuing with most young people being away, or is there some role they can play even if they're not in Zimbabwe? Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. My name is Barbara Borst. I'm with New York University Center for Global Affairs, and before that I spent most of my career in journalism. So I have two questions. One builds off the one that you just heard. We've heard about We've heard about what can or can't be done inside Zimbabwe or Africa or internationally, but there are something on the order of 3 million Zimbabweans in other countries, notably in South Africa. So I'm wondering about what role you might picture for them. And the second question is, I know that you've spent a lot of effort to protect or to argue on behalf of journalists in Zimbabwe and from Zimbabwe, and I wondered if you would just bring us up to date on the issues that you see as most important there. Thank you.
Of course, I can remember your question easier since it has just come. We do have a media commission under the Constitution, which is, of course, supposed to look after the media. We've been talking for God knows how long on media diversity, on opening the airwaves in Zimbabwe, on doing away with this requirement that journalists must be accredited by the state. We have had the new Minister of Information who's recycled from 2001 when he brought in the restrictive media laws, come back with a bang saying, yes, I agree, all of these laws are bad laws. Yes, we should open up broadcasting. Yes, the state broadcaster should be turned into a public broadcaster. Yes, the state newspapers should stop, playing the role of being mouthpieces for politicians. And I want to re-engage with journalists. The jury is still out if actually he means what he is saying. And we will know again as and when the relevant legislation is amended and or a new act altogether comes out into play. Like everything else, the media continues to be as polarized as before. We basically have the state media, which is supposed to be media really that looks after the interests of everybody, beholden to politics. We just might be lucky in that there might be enough acrimony within the current ruling party to actually break that. We've seen in the last 6 to 8 weeks stories in the state media that would never have been in the state media because of the factions that are fighting for control. So a faction that controls the media uses it to attack the other faction. And in a bizarre sort of way, we are having those factional fights expose the fact that actually the media is a huge problem because they are the ones who encourage a lot of the problems by trying to divide the people of Zimbabwe into camps, because it's like it's a criminal offense to belong to a party other than a party that is in power in Zimbabwe, when actually legally political parties are allowed. So we might see some changes in the media if what the minister says is going to happen. But because he's on record, most of the media civic organizations are already on him. My personal view, because people are saying, oh, it's going to take forever for these things to happen, they'll never promulgate the legislation. My view is that if I am a lawyer and I believe that the Human Rights Commission must have the necessary legislation to operate, I have an obligation to sit down with like-minded people, craft legislation which we think is correct and is proper legislation that will take us forward. Say to the relevant minister, okay, we know, Minister, you are a very busy man or woman. We have taken it upon ourselves to assist you. Here is the draft piece of legislation for you to take to Parliament. And we're encouraging our friends in the media to do that, and basically across the board, so that we don't have this excuse that, oh, there's too many pieces of legislation, we have to craft 87 pieces of legislation, it just is taking too much time. I believe civil society has a role to play in ensuring that that process is done quickly by giving their time and expertise in crafting the legislation on a sector-by-sector basis. You've spoken about Zimbabweans in the diaspora and how those of us who operate from Zimbabwe can partner with them. You know, a lot of the Zimbabweans in the diaspora were not properly grouped in terms of organizations, and those that were generally, grouped on party political, sections. Like they were as divided outside as we are inside. And sometimes it's extremely difficult to get them to act as a unit and to do things for the good of Zimbabwe, as opposed to advancing the position of whatever political party they were after. In the past, I had worked very closely with some civil society, some diasporians. I even took a case to the Constitutional Court trying to get them the vote in 2005, which was unsuccessful, not unexpectedly. And but I mean, it was like the only thing that brought them together. So it's very, very difficult to deal with individuals. And sometimes we've dealt with individuals and found that some of them then go and fundraise for Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe never sees the monies that are raised. But maybe going forward, we might find ways of ensuring that we get more collaboration with Zimbabweans in the diaspora. The problem also is that a lot of the Zimbabweans, when they look at what's happening in Zimbabwe, simply stop seeing themselves as Zimbabweans who go back to Zimbabwe, because it's like, what are we going back there for? I mean, if you've lived in Zimbabwe for the past 10 years, your kids are born in the States or in the UK, I mean, it becomes more and more difficult to think of Zimbabwe as home and to actually physically want to go back there. It's a nice place to go on holiday once a year with your kids, and that's it. And then there's the disconnect, complete disconnect, because sometimes they don't even understand what the conditions are like, because they are there for 2-3 weeks in a year and they don't actually see the need to do what needs to be done. But I'm sure if we sit down and seriously look at what can be done, we could find ways of partnering with the Zimbabweans in the diaspora. And then there was a question about young people in Zimbabwe. You know, most cultures have complete disrespect for young people. That is why we never have a youth commission, or we've got all these human rights commissions, etc. But generally, the youths are disregarded in most societies, and which is completely unfortunate. Zimbabwe is no different. And yes, it is true that a lot of young people are out, but those that are there, it's incredible. Actually, as we went towards the elections, it was quite incredible to see how the youths have been conditioned to think that the only way to survive in Zimbabwe is not education or working hard, etc. It is to join a political party. And we had set up this youth fund, which was abused to have the monies dispersed on a partisan basis. So all these young people now believe that the only way you can make it in Zimbabwe is to join a certain political party, because you will have access to the money from this fund, and you don't therefore need to do anything else because you made. And this is coming from the fact that they see their fathers, their uncles, and all the older people making a very good living from that kind of politics. And unfortunately, with the unemployment being at over 80%, young people don't have much to go back to in Zimbabwe if they're out. And those that are in Zimbabwe, they are very definitely unemployed. And you can have your degree, but you're not going to get a job. Youths used to be very, very organized in terms of agitating for rights. But the politicians have managed to actually, divide them into political camps. So for every student organization in any institution, there is a counter one. If this one is believed to be MDC, there'll be another one who will be seen as ZANU-PF. And the chaos they breed in that institution is not difficult to imagine, which means then they lose their core focus on what would take the youth forward. Zimbabwean youths are very educated, but the majority of them can't even go to institutions of higher learning because the money is just not there. I mean, if government used to fund education, it isn't doing so anymore because the money just isn't there. So maybe one way of doing it would be to look at a non-partisan and non-government controlled way of funding students to go to tertiary educations. Of course, the children of the elite do not go to universities in Zimbabwe. Our children as elite go outside for education and probably don't come back. But I think we do need to look at the youths as our future leaders by ensuring that they learn the right things, which is why I believe very strongly that there has to be an organized way of making them see that the right path to good governance is a path that will not be following the guys that are there before us. Yeah. You also talked about civil society and human rights and countries that are seen to be implementing decisions of some of the African institutions. It's so difficult because sometimes you are told that, oh, this country is a beacon of democracy. And when you speak to the civil society activists from there, like, oh, please forget it. It's not like that. I mean, we are next door to Botswana in Southern Africa. And Botswana is put forward as one of the shining beacons of democracy. But when you speak to people in Botswana, the stories they come up with, which never even get to the press, are horrendous. So you never really know whether, in fact, there is any country that is really functioning in a manner that you would say it was as envisaged in the founding statutes of the AU. You have South Africa. South Africa is sliding down very fast, but it has a constitution which still is largely implemented by a judiciary that is independent. And that makes a huge difference in that probably in the region it is the only country where the president and the ministers are regularly taken to court and they lose the cases and they are obliged to implement the decisions, even begrudgingly, of the courts. And which is why an independent judiciary, in my view, is really, really, you know, one of the main pillars of any democratic dispensation. So I would say that, yeah, they must be there. I mean, some are not as rampant as countries like Zimbabwe or Swaziland, or, you know, I mean, in Swaziland, I was informed by the lawyers there that last year the government had a 100% rate of winning its cases in court. And that the Minister of Justice wanted to throw a party to thank the judiciary. I mean, you know, that's how blatant it is, and it's quite sad that that should happen, because you can see that the government sees the judiciary or the judges as their guys that need to be patted on the back for doing a good job, because I mean that kind of win is completely unheard of. You just made a comment about your democracy fund. I will spread the word. You probably might regret having given me that information, but thank you very much for the support. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Beatrice. I saw two hands, Mr. Laurenti, Renzo. Yes. Okay, so we have more than 3 questions. I think we'll have 2 more rounds. I was hoping that it would be the last one, but we'll have 2 more rounds. So we'll start with Mr. Laurenti.
Jeff Laurenti, or Laurenti, if you will, Ms. Affa'a-Mindzie. Ms. Mtetwa, you had mentioned the reality of factions within the ruling party, within ZANU. President Mugabe, at least to the outside, seems to be the glue that holds all those factions together. But any life insurance actuary would now be reluctant to issue a new policy, given that there aren't many more years before it will be cashed. when the day that his life insurance becomes payable, what do you see as the factions within ZANU that will be pressing in different directions? Are any of them interested in these issues of expanding protections for human rights or an independent judiciary? Does what is left of the MDC after this year's debacle make the rights question part of the political agenda? And how do these issues translate in the countryside to something that matters to the average rural voter?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm Renzo Pomi with Amnesty International. It's nice to see you here, and thank you for the presentation, and thanks to IPI for inviting you. As you invited us to raise issues which you didn't raise during your presentation, I wanted to refer to two that we raised in our last report recently. One is on the situation of the many hundreds of thousands of families displaced or evicted during the massive eviction campaign or operation in 2005, and the other one on the death penalty. According to our information, there had been some progress both in the law and also in expressions by officials on limitations on the use of the penalty. But the question is whether you see any scope for a moratorium or even abolition.
Scope for?
For a moratorium on the use of on the application of the death penalty or abolition altogether from the books. And the previous part of the question was on Operation Murambisvina, if I am pronouncing it well, the forced eviction campaign in 2005 and the situation of the families now. Thanks.
Lucy Webster from the Center for War Peace Studies. I'm wondering, as regards young people in Zimbabwe, whether there's any effort to have groups of like young Rotarians or enterprise groups or the sort of German pattern of training programs instead of university, that sort of thing that would get people involved in doing something really useful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your questions. Young people, we do have a very sort of active and vibrant Rotary clubs in Zimbabwe, but generally those clubs tend to be for the middle class, middle-aged elite, and I don't know that they actually encourage young people. In fact, young people would be like, "Why would I want to be with those old geezers? You know, they're so boring." I think training programs would be extremely useful for the young people, particularly in trying to come up with income-generating programs. But the problem is almost always funding, because there simply is nobody to fund those kind of training programs. So, I mean, it very definitely would be useful for organizations, particularly youth organizations in the developed world, to try and partner with our young people back there so that they can help each other, you know, get some form of training and fundraise for whatever might be necessary. I mean, you know, Zimbabweans are not lazy people. Zimbabweans love farming, for instance, and if young people are properly trained and they're given pieces of land, they would be able to actually make a difference. But as I said, young people are almost always disregarded. They're like women, you know. When they talk of land, the men think the land belongs to them and them alone. They don't think that they are young people. They don't think that they are women who actually must have access to the same resources. When they talk of indigenization in Zimbabwe, they are not talking about young people and or women, they're thinking of themselves as men, that 51% in that foreign company must be theirs. So, it would very definitely be helpful to start programs that would get young people exchanging ideas and helping each other get back to at least a situation where they are able to sustain themselves. Death penalty. Zimbabwe is interesting. Death penalty is on the statute books, but there has been a huge reluctance for quite some time to actually implement it. So you find that we've hardly had any hangings because everybody accepts that really it ought not to be there. But no one has the guts within the ruling elite to literally take it out of the statute books. And they always cite South Africa that, oh, you see what's happening in South Africa. Since they abolished the death penalty, they are killing each other like, life is worth nothing. So there's that, interesting, development where they won't abolish it altogether, but they claim that they cannot find a hangman who will effect the hangings. Our current Minister of Justice was an inmate on death row. And if there's one person who might be able to actually bring that to an end, it might be him, because he knows what it is like to wait to be killed in death row. So maybe, there might be hope there. You never know. Displaced families. We have many displaced families in Zimbabwe, firstly from the farm invasions. Many of the farm workers were rendered homeless virtually, but we all know that nothing has happened to them. Then we had the state-organized displacements in the form of Mrambatsina, where people's homes were destroyed and they were not given any alternatives. In terms of the new constitution, for instance, if you want to evict people, you have to offer them alternatives. Whether that's going to happen again will depend on when we try to see how the new constitution is being implemented. We have managed, since the constitution came into effect, to get orders to stop evictions where no alternatives have been given from the High Court. Whether going forward that will continue, we do not know. But there have been attempts. In fact, in some areas they managed to actually evict some persons, but in those areas where notice had been given, and as lawyers for human rights we were able to go to court, we were actually able to get court orders interdicting the state from evicting persons without having given them alternative places where they should go to. But I don't think going forward there is any real attempt to deal with previous displaced persons. I think this is where the new Peace and Reconciliation Commission will come in, because I think this is one of the matters that have to be dealt with and have to be taken to them to look into. And also the Zimbabwean Human Rights Commission has to deal with that if actually it will be of any meaning to your ordinary person in the street. So on those two, the jury is still out. We'll see how things progress as and when we try aspects of the new constitution in the courts. Right, the insurance question. I talk a lot to people in ZANU-PF. I represented many of them before the current divide. It's amazing how the bad people in ZANU-PF are so few, but they are few and powerful. I'm absolutely certain that the majority of people in ZANU-PF want a Zimbabwe they can be proud of. I'm absolutely certain that people in ZANU-PF who are business people want a working business environment because they can only thrive with an environment like that. I'm absolutely certain that they are as many, people in ZANU-PF who in their professions who believe that they would be better off if they did things differently. The catch is, how do they articulate that without being seen to be sellouts? And I do believe that as the old order fades and a new order comes up, the excesses may not be as much as we've seen them in the past. And that probably, we might have, all of these changes within ZANU-PF itself. That is why you are getting this Minister of Information who's notorious, actually saying that we've learned from the past, this doesn't work. Because I can't imagine they enjoy being pariahs wherever they go. Because, it just doesn't work. And I am absolutely certain that at some stage, depending on how the faction issue is resolved, we probably will have a very, very moderate ZANU-PF because the majority of them are not bad people.
Okay. Thank you, Beatrice. We are now going to have our last round of questions. I think I saw the gentleman in the last row, Rosalie. Yes, Mrs. Gay Rosenblum-Kumar.
Thank you very much for sharing these very instructive perspectives with us from Zimbabwe. But let me say here that perhaps what obtains in Zimbabwe is not quite so different from what obtains in some other countries as well on the continent, in terms of governance issues as well as the failure of the judiciary to deliver justice. The question here is how do we make the judiciary more functional and independent in terms of its decision and to be able to deliver justice? The other question here has to do with the governance institutions. How do we make them really independent that would actually ensure that the level of political interference is being reduced to the barest minimal? And the last one has to do with civil society. It has gotten to the point that even the civil society in some of these countries are polarized. What could be the solution to this?
Sorry, can you come again?
Civil society.
Solution.
The solution to the question of the civil society themselves becoming kind of caught in between the political divide. Thank you.
Thank you. Gay Rosenblum-Kumar with the UN. Thank you very much for this presentation. My question is a bit similar to others. It's to dig a little bit deeper into what would be the entry points in governance, in participatory development, in reconciliation, where there could be receptivity to change if the international community and the UN could support things that would be positive. I mention that particularly because of your comment about needing leadership development. And I'm sorry the ambassador from Somalia left, because I wanted to mention that in Kenya, during their constitutional process, UNDP organized a very intensive leadership development training for all parliamentarians and many members of government. That was not a one-off, but happened over many weekends over the course of several months, which really dealt with people's values, their cultural values, historical values, personal values, and aligning them with what governance meant. And I think some of the results were very impressive, and I would hope that perhaps something like this could be transferred. But where do you see the entry points in parliament, in local government, in the private sector, in women's groups, on natural resources issues? And what do you think, and it's a large question, but concretely, could the UN or the international community do to capacitate the receptive people
for positive changes that will hopefully come in the long term. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rosalie Nézien. I work for the American Jewish World Service. I'd like to echo everyone here. Thank you for your brilliance, and thank you for telling us so much more about Zimbabwe. My question is on a personal level. I'd like to know what keeps you going, moving on? What gives you that hope to continue your activism in spite of everything? Yeah, in spite of everything that you're going through. And second, I would love to know, as a women human rights activist, what are some of the tactics that you use to protect yourself? And what kind of advice would you give to other women rights activists? In my foundation, I work with activists who work in Congo, for instance, and sometimes I feel like I've exhausted, the resources that I know of, like referring to Urgent Action Fund, or Frontline for Human Rights Defenders and Protection International. So I'd really love to know what you do to protect yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. That was our last question. Thank
All
you.
right. Okay. I'll again respond to it first. The way I look at my work, I actually use, and I know that gender activists always are unhappy with me saying this, but I actually use my being a woman to get away with things that men wouldn't get away with. And it's very difficult for a big man to beat up a small woman. They do it from time to time, but I've learned how to use my skills as a woman to get away with things that otherwise would get me into trouble. But this is not to suggest that we just run head in with whatever we might be doing. As under Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, we have fast reaction units. We cover up for each other. We have agreed that there are certain places where you can't go on your own. We have backups, we have hotlines, and so if you're called to a place where you know there might be danger, you call on your colleagues to say, I need reinforcements. This is where we're going to, and from time to time it works. Sometimes it doesn't work, but there is almost always strength in numbers. I remember in 2007 when we had a lot of the politicians beaten up and locked up, and we had no clue where they were, and we were going from police station to police station to find out where they were. And finally, when we got wind that they'd been taken to the central police station, and there were about 9 of us, and we got there, and we wanted to go in, and there were 8 policemen with in riot gear, armed at the door of the police station. I'm in a police station. Anyone is supposed to go in there anytime. It's open 24 hours. I said, right. We were told not to let the group with Mtetwa come in. Are you that group? So we had to think quickly. I said, oh, no, we actually saw that group. They just used the other entrance, and they rushed to the other side, and we went in. So you got to think on your feet sometimes, in order to be able to play it their own way. But I found that the thing that works the best is to go there and be as nice as possible to them. You get a young constable there who has no clue who you are and what you can be up to, and you speak to them nicely, and and you get what you want. By the time his bosses realize that, oh, you ought not to have told them that we have this inmate here, it's too late. We already know that they are there. So you got to think on your feet. You got to be there for each other as and when necessary, and certainly you should not go into dangerous territory without cover. you know. So when I go to dangerous places, I have a big belly young man in my office who I always call upon to come with me, and it helps. Also, just from the perspective that if you are on your own, if you disappear, nobody will even know what has happened to you. So it is absolutely crucial, if you're going to continue doing the work, to take protective measures, because if you're dead, you are not of any use to anybody. What keeps me going? I believe that I'm just doing this work because it's my work. You know, if the people whose rights are being violated, that's enough to keep me going, because it's a job that has to be done. And I feel very strongly that human rights defenders get targeted for doing their work when actually they are counterparts. If a doctor treats a victim of political violence, nobody does anything to them. If I defend the same victim, somebody thinks I shouldn't be doing it, and I get reprisals for it. And I just find it completely stupid that happens, because it's my job to defend people. If you don't want me to defend them, don't, you know, mess up with their rights. If you don't arrest them, if you don't beat them up, if you don't torture them, I'm not going to be there. But if you do, I am going to be there. So that's what keeps me going. If people need representation, you know, you have to represent them. And it's becoming harder and harder in Zimbabwe to find lawyers to do certain kinds of work, because when I get arrested for doing my work, a younger lawyer will refuse to go to a scene like that because they don't want to get arrested. And so, you know, it's important for me also to just set an example for the younger lawyers, to say it's okay to do this. Yes, you can get beaten up from time to time, or you can get locked up from time to time, but hey, even Mandela got out after 27 years. So, you know, you'll come out anyway at some stage. Yeah. Other question. You referred to leadership training and gave Kenya as an example. You know, what I find different is that in Kenya, there was political will. And I think that makes a huge difference, where the people, the politicians, civil society, everybody wants to do what is right. And also I found, I mean, my interaction with Kenyan civil society has also shown that there is a lot more unity there than we see in Zimbabwe. You know, I remember when the judiciary in Kenya was bad news, the lawyers took decisions to you know, ostracize their colleagues who were part of the problem. You know, if you came and you found a group of lawyers there and you are one of the lawyers who are deliberately assisting those who are trying to compromise the rule of law, they would all walk away from you. You know, there is nothing they didn't do, but the lawyers' body acted as a unit. In Zimbabwe, you find that it is other lawyers who will say, arrest her, do this to her, you know, because they're getting benefits from the other side, you know. A whole lot of things that are happening because lawyers are part and parcel of that. So the unity of purpose is absolutely crucial, and it happens if there's some form of unity. Politicians always try to use a divide and rule tactic, and I found that Kenyan civil society was much stronger in terms of being together, you know, and that is why you had some of their activists being appointed to lofty heights, even within the judiciary, because people understand that you need strong individuals to carry the country forward. And if you are strong in governance, you are not likely to fall by the wayside as easily as someone who has no CV to talk of in terms of guaranteeing rights. So maybe in Zimbabwe we do need that, and the leadership training would certainly assist, but we need more than just leadership training. We also need a lot of judicial training, just starting right down from the magistrates, so that they understand that, it's okay to do the right thing. A lot of them are good people, but they are scared. Just like the judges, you have a few compromised at the top, but the majority of them want to do the right thing, and they tell you when you meet them in private that we are scared, and if you're scared, you get compromised, not because you're a bad person, but, self-preservation is really something that we all fall back to far too quickly at times. You also raised the issue of what the international community can do with regards to, resource issues, to gender issues, resource issues are a problem. Because while the West might talk with, very clear, tongues when it comes to political issues, if they do speak with folk tongues when it comes to resource issues. You've seen that countries that are regarded as, countries that are very conscious on human rights have been very quick to say, your diamonds are clean. We want them in Antwerp. Why? Because it's money. They want their economies to grow. So when it comes to resource issues, I don't think we can expect to get from the West as much assistance as we require, because big business is involved there. So I don't know that we can get much from them. But yeah, we do need to deal with issues to do with gender. Zimbabwe has very good legislation on gender issues, etc. But we have absolutely no training on how best to take those good laws forward in terms of implementation. And this is because we don't have a strategy which ensures that gender issues are dealt with by persons who understand gender. You get a gender issue being placed before a judge who's the biggest chauvinist on the bench. And, they just can't deal with them. So I think we do need a lot of training in that aspect, particularly in the judiciary. I'm told that my time is up.
We are actually over time already. Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you. We really hope that these events will counter the current Zimbabwe fatigue, and we understand we still need to continue to support civil society's efforts in advancing good governance and the rule of law. Thank you to you all for your participation. Thank you.